Jerri Ward, back with my guest, G. Edward Griffin, and we were just talking about his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, and let me tell you, this book is an interesting book. It's not dry. It's about the history of banking, but it reads more like a mystery novel than like a dry textbook treatise on the history of banking, and I would recommend that all of you get this book and read it, because I think it's important that every citizen read it. And Mr. Griffin, why don't you tell the folks where they can get this book?
Well, thank you, Jerry. It's available, of course, at most of the Internet bookstores, but if you want to get it right from our site, that's called Reality Zone. And you have a chance to look at maybe 100 different books and videotapes and audio tapes on a similar topic. So the address there is www.realityzone.com.
Okay,
That's it.
Great. And let's talk about what was happening out in Jekyll Island. Let's finish that up. We left off where all these powerful men in secret went to Jekyll Island to come up with legislation that they could push their senators and representatives in Congress to pass.
Yes. The secrecy is a very important aspect to this story. You mentioned a moment ago that The Creature from Jekyll Island is more like a mystery story, and it really is. I saw this as not a dry treatise on banking theory. It's a whodunit, and when I found out who did it, and what they did and how they did it, that's how I wrote the book. And the secrecy is an integral part of that understanding. When people do things in secret, there's usually something to hide. And I was curious when I found out the great lengths to which these men went to keep their meeting a secret. I thought, what are they trying to hide? So basically, here's the story, Jerry. It was in 1910, in November of 1910, when there were 7 men that were instructed to meet in secret at the New Jersey Railroad station, where they were to come to the station one at a time, not to be seen together, not to dine together at the night of their arrival, and not to talk to newspaper reporters and that sort of thing. One of them arrived with a shotgun in a big black case, so that if somebody had asked him where he was going, he was prepared to say he was going on a duck hunting trip. And we find out later that from his children and his biographer that this man never fired a shotgun or any kind of a gun, didn't even own one. That was a borrowed weapon just for the purposes of deception. And when they arrived at the station, they were assembled aboard the private railroad car of Senator Nelson Aldrich. And when they got on the car, they were told when they spoke with each other not to address each other by their last names, to use first names only. And in the cases of 2 of those men, they abandoned their first names and spoke in terms of code words. They used code names for each other, and this sort of thing. And I thought, boy, that was really strange that they should do that kind of thing. Later, one of the men who was on board that train wrote a book about it, and he described why they did that. He said the purpose was so that the servants on board the train would not know who all of those men were. Now, obviously, the servants knew who Senator Aldrich was because they worked for him, and they might have known the names of 1 or possibly 2 of the others, but not all of them. And they were afraid that the servants might talk later on, and if the word leaked out in that fashion, then the purpose of the meeting would be subverted. And so they traveled for 2 nights and a day aboard this luxurious private railroad car. I'm sure they were talking about the purpose of their meeting all the way. And when they woke up the second morning at Brunswick, Georgia, they were taken to the ferry boat and crossed the inland straits to Jekyll Island. And as I mentioned a moment ago, it was a private island. It was owned by some of the wealthiest families in the world. And they went to the clubhouse. And by the way, the clubhouse is still there. It's been maintained very well. You can visit it on Jekyll Island today. And for the next week, they sat around at a little table there in the room, and they hammered out all the details of what became the Federal Reserve Act. And then at the end of that period, they came back to the Brunswick and back on board the private car, and then another 2 nights and a day, and they're back in New Jersey, and finally they disappeared into the environs of Wall Street. That's where they came from. And for years afterwards, or not years, but over a year afterwards, these men denied that they had ever been to a meeting when they were asked. And it wasn't until after the Federal Reserve Act was passed and had become revered almost by the average American as a great American institution, only then did these men begin to talk openly about their participation. And then it was funny because they began to, it seemed as though they were competing with each other, claiming that they were the most important, influential party in the group in creating the Federal Reserve. So you can now go to any well-stocked library, and you can read, after all these years, the private papers of these people and the biographies of these people, and you can find out in great detail exactly what went on there and what happened.
You can't expect that they thought that the American people would think that this was in their best interest with such secrecy, and in fact, it hasn't turned out to be in the best interest of the American people. And do we have first of all, do we have a caller on the phone? John?
Yes, you do.
I do want to get into the creating money, but...
Well, let me just take a moment, if I may, and wrap this up, this reason for the secrecy.
Okay.
Because it won't take long. It's very clear. And the question finally, right there, why would they do that? Why didn't they just say they went and they did it? And the answer is because the Federal Reserve Act was sold to the American people as a means of controlling the banking interests. There was a slogan they used in those days, break the grip of the money trust. That was what the whole purpose of the Federal Reserve Act was to do. And it turns out that the people who wrote the Federal Reserve Act were the money trust. Those men, I could mention the names of them, but you'll find it all in the book, the 7 men there represented through the banking institutions which they operated and their personal wealth as well. And they had connections with the Warburgs in Germany and the Netherlands and the Rothschilds in France and England. You add all of this wealth together, and it adds up to about 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. That was the wealth that was represented by those men that went to Jekyll Island. And if that wasn't the money trust, I don't know what it was.
Well, and they obfuscated.
Of course, because, had the world known that the money trust wrote the legislation that supposedly was to control their own power, of course, the scam would have been out in the open, and the bill would never have been passed. And that was the reason for the secrecy.
Okay. I think I'm going to axe the sound clips, and Mr. Griffin, will you stay on for the next to the last segment, and because we just have too much to talk about, and we also have a caller, Chuck from Austin, who wants to ask a question. So let's just do that. There's just too much information here. So,
I'll be happy to.
Okay, why don't we have Chuck come on the line and ask his question?
Hi, Jerry.
Yes.
Hi, Jerry. This is Chuck Young in Austin. Hi, Mr. Griffin. I actually read the first. I had a copy of the first edition of Creature. I've given away a couple of copies of the book over the years, so I don't have that one anymore.
Thank you.
So I've been into this subject for a long time. But there's I hear that you were just talking about the history, and did you get into the Aldrich bill and the obfuscation that Jerry was talking about?
Yeah.
Well, we haven't come to that part of the history yet. But,
there's so much to talk about. I just wanted to ask a really brief question because I'm really frustrated with something that's been talked about a lot by a lot of people. I've been hearing this for 20 years, that the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional, and I've always felt that the Federal Reserve is extra constitutional, but I don't think a persuasive argument can be made that it's unconstitutional. And I'd like to hear your take on that.
Well, that's an interesting point, the difference between unconstitutional and aconstitutional. It's certainly aconstitutional, there's no question about that. I believe it is unconstitutional because what it does is not authorized by the Constitution. In fact, it's prohibited. The Constitution prohibits the issuance of money unless it is backed by gold or silver. That's what Congress is limited to, and since that's Congress's power, Congress is unable to delegate anything which it does not have to anyone else. So Congress could not have delegated a power to the Federal Reserve, which itself it did not have. So therefore, it's not constitutional.
Yeah, my argument against that would be that the power to emit bills of, to me, Federal Reserve notes are not strictly speaking money. And I realize it's a sophistry, but I think it's one that has to be kind of dealt with. The power to emit bills of credit is, in fact, reserved to the people. And my argument would be that FRNs are really bills of credit. I mean, there's no specie backing at all anymore, even fractionally, is there?
No, there's nothing.
Yeah, so I mean, the joke to me is that they're not even money. Of course, we talk about a lot of things that are money. That we talk about money that isn't money and wars that aren't war. But anyway, I was just curious to get your take on that.
Well, it does depend somewhat on your definitions of these terms. I think you're right.
Yeah.
If you take the general definition of money as anything which is a medium of exchange, then the Federal Reserve notes would be money. But if you take the classical definition of money as something which is a storehouse of value, then it's not money.
Right.
All right.
Just specifically, the actual wording in the Constitution is to coin money, and that's why I've always felt like the intent of the framers was more specie-based. And I have one other question, and I'll just get off the line.
May I just comment on that quickly?
Okay.
Yes, you could interpret to coin money as meaning to create money, or you could interpret it as to base it upon coin. And the answer to that question is definitely answered by the debates during the Constitutional Convention. They were talking about physical coins.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why they made a distinction between that and the emission of bills of credit.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. And I just like to leave you, if you can at some point talk about some of the manipulation that's going on in the gold markets in the last 10 years, and the gold carry trade, and coming on the heels of the currency carrying trades like the yen carry trade. I think that'd be great to kind of bring it home to what's happening today in the markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you.
All right. Did you want to answer that last question, or is that more appropriate down the line after we finish the history?
Well, I think we were on a better track before, because the question which was just raised is an extremely important one, but it's kind of a postgraduate type of issue. We want to make sure all the folks have the basics right now, the basic information. Yes.
And you were going to talk about the Aldrich bill, I believe, was your next point.
Well, that was one of the issues that was brought up, and the fact that these men who created the Federal Reserve Act now had to sell it to Congress, and they had to convince the Congress and the American people that it was really in their best interest. And so the first version of the act was called the Aldrich Bill, and Paul Warburg, who was one of those participants in that founding meeting, said to Senator Aldrich, he said, Nelson, you don't put your name on this bill because you are so well identified with the banking interests. You see, he was a business associate of J.P. Morgan. He was the father-in-law of Rockefeller. And, he was right there among all the bankers. He was a well-known Republican, and the Republicans in those days, well, still today, they have this reputation of being the business capitalists and bankers and so forth. So he said, don't put your name on it because it'll be voted down as the bill of the big bankers. And sure enough, it was. And so they didn't slow down at that. They just found a couple of Democrats to sponsor essentially the same bill. They called it the Carter-Glass bill. And now that it's a Democrat bill, it was okay in the eyes of the American people.
Well, yeah, that's really interesting. And you're going to stay for our next to the last segment, aren't you? And we're going to go into what the Federal Reserve actually does and how it essentially destroys our economy. So everyone stay tuned, and we'll be back with Mr. Griffin after the break.